Hello and welcome to the sixth lecture in the series of lectures about the economic and social history of late modern Malta. And in the sixth lecture, we're going to do the final years of what I would call the intermittent economy, because I don't like the description of the cyclical economy, because with a cyclical economy we mean in economics we usually mean something else. So I don't like when we describe the period between the 1800s and the Second World War in Malta as having a cyclical economy. I would prefer to describe it as an intermittent economy. So some would describe it as our economic cycle, which was dependent on wars, basically. And basically, this economic setup and this economic evolution was over in 1945 due to multiple overwhelming and radical changes to the whole world and to Malta as well because of the Second World War. And Malta was, especially the three cities and Valletta and the surrounding suburbs, they were bombed heavily and reconstruction was required. So there was the War Damage Fund, which kicked off a very long, decades-long construction property boom, which we will discuss in more detail eventually later, because it had basically major implications for the Maltese economy. And we've already seen the foundations of the welfare state, and we've seen the mixture of these foundations between the legislation that was passed in the 1920s across multiple parties in government, and also the foundations of the welfare state that were enacted by the introduction of for example, the medical department prior to the war by the British government prior to the Second World War. And these were already discussed in the previous lectures. So you had reconstruction, you had the foundations of a welfare state, and you have the emergence of a new fiscal setup. As we've discussed earlier, you had the abolition of the grain tax, and now you also had the introduction of the income tax. The Labour Party wins general elections in 1947 and introduces the income tax in 1948, which would set basically the new fiscal regime in Malta, which we still have today. And basically you have the reconstruction of the whole island, and also the reconstruction of the economy as a whole, the reconstruction of businesses, the reconstruction of services. So essentially we've gone from an intermittent economy from the 1800 to 1940s and 1945 by the end of the Second World War to sustained and slow economic growth. Now we're going to see the last phase of we're going to see in economic terms, and we're going to discuss a paper, an interesting paper, which is relevant also to our previous discussions, to discuss the last phase in economic terms before this new economic period arrived. So we're going to discuss the 1930s and the 1920s again through a paper which I will show. This is how intermittent economic growth basically happened in the 19th century, and then you had the First World War, and then you had the 1920s and the 1930s, which we are going to discuss again briefly here through an interesting paper which I would like to make reference, not because I agree with this paper, but it provides an interesting discussion which should be accounted for, and it's also one of the most latest discussions about economic social history. So we've done these already, so this is just to revise. So the important paper that I'm going to discuss briefly is by Alexander Apostolides, who wrote a paper called The Growth of Two Small Economies in the Great Depression, GDP Estimation for Cyprus and Malta During the Interwar Period 1921-1938. And basically, well, this is his own reconstruction of GDP growth in Malta, and the problem that we have in economic and social history is that we lack a lot of data, and a lot of data is sparse across different sources. So you have to collect it and reconstruct a lot of different stuff. And these reconstructions usually would be also very laborious, because data available can be very granular, and not all of the data is available, or it is not available in the way we would like it to be. We've already discussed, we've already had a lecture about sources, and that's why it's very important. And we could go into further detail into the blue books to discuss these kind of nuances. And we've discussed some of these nuances already, but we can go into further detail. However, one of the problems with this paper is that it has basically large portions of its reconstructions of its models, of reconstructed models, with data that is missing, and he's not very clear in some of his methodologies as well. So we're gonna see why, but I'm uploading this just to give a brief idea of what the GDP would have been composed of during the 1920s and 1930s. And this is just to give a brief idea, because to get the exact data and the exact figures, that would require a laborious exercise, mainly through data acquired from the blue books and other official government sources, such as census, which he also uses, and salary lists, especially by government service workers working with the Admiralty, price lists from the government gazette, and you have to collect different data, and you also have to understand it in some specific context as well. So this is not to present exact figures, but just to give an idea. So most of his data is in fact acquired also from census and blue books. And we can see that Cyprus had a larger labor force, and Malta's labor force, of course, was mostly concentrated in the service sector, and Cyprus was more agricultural. So Malta clearly, and throughout the discussions we have also seen about the paper of Paul Caruana Galizia, Malta clearly was more dependent on the British base than Cyprus was. And Malta was more dependent on the British. It was more dependent on the British Navy, and the agricultural component of the economy was less. And whatever the agricultural component was left in these years, it was increasingly becoming less industrial, so to speak, and more self-subsistent kind of farming. Because the industrial kind of agriculture that Malta had was with regard to cotton. And after cotton, there basically was no product which replaced the monocrop economy. And most of the new farming along the years was self-subsistent and very small trading and family run businesses. So we can see that Cyprus has a much larger component with regard to agriculture. So what he does with regard to his models, which is interesting to discuss, is that he tries to compare the prices between Malta and Cyprus through the Fisher Index, and uses the purchasing power parity comparison to attempt to eliminate price distortions. And when he does this, he claims to have found that the GDP per capita for Cyprus was actually higher than Malta's. And he says that prices in Malta were higher, and he finds this as a distortion. So this is why GDP per employee for him is higher in Cyprus, because he finds this price distortion, and he says, look, this is obfuscating the actual value of the economy and the actual output of the economy. Now this is a valid argument, and this is a valid argument and interesting argument, but I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with it. This is once again also part of my critique of the alchemy of economic history, especially in cases where you have to reconstruct your models and data and everything, because you're lacking a lot of data and material. And what I suspect is that he lacks in his reconstructions are the output values of the base economy, of the British base economy, which can be, like for example, the expenditure of the garrison. Because if you try to, the problem with PPP and the Fisher index is that if you try to apply it to remove price distortions, the problem is that you have no guarantee that the products produced in Cyprus at Maltese prices would be sold at Maltese prices in Cyprus. So you have a very strong demand factor which is being obfuscated here. Now, there can be actual distortions. I'm not saying that there cannot be actual distortions, such as, for example, the monopoly effect of Maltese traders. Especially since Malta had to import more of its food than Cyprus had to import its own food. Because Cyprus had a larger agricultural share in its economy. So there may be some truth in these price distortions, but they may not be accurate in the mathematical representations of these distortions. So in fact, he calculates, of course, annual growth for Cyprus higher. It's PPP adjusted. So my suspicion here is that there is an undercalculation, a misundercalculation of the British base, of the significance of the British base expenditure by the garrison, for example. So as you can see, his purchasing power parity adjusted GDP is higher for Cyprus. Now, look, if we want to go in detail, and this is what I would prefer to do in economic history, and to best avoid getting involved in alchemy, because when trying to adjust for distortions the way he does, it can be dangerous, especially since you do not have all the data at hand, and also accounting for demand factors. It is very useful to really check the data itself. And some of the most important data is government expenditure and revenue. And as you can see, the government and expenditure revenue for Cyprus was lower than in Malta. I have a missing slide, or maybe I do not know why the other slide is coming up. However, the reality is, I think I have a slide missing. I will see later on. But look, the reality is that you had a larger population in Cyprus and lower government revenue and expenditure. Okay, so look, I think if we are going to compare the the cost of living between Malta and Cyprus, we have to account for distortions and differences already discussed about the paper by Paul Caruana Galizia. Look, let me clear this out first, because Maltese government expenditure and revenue was higher, and with a population that was less in Cyprus, okay? So, and you have to also check trade, imports and exports, and compare. But at face value, we have already seen why, even with the paper by Paul, that the Maltese had better, at average, they had better living conditions than the Cypriots. But the issue with this is that there was significant inequalities in Malta, and these inequalities would eventually distort your average to a significant extent. And even between the extremes of your average, you have also a lot of divergences there as well. And you also had, in Malta, you had the large factor of emigration, people leaving the islands, which basically served as a safety valve for the economy not to collapse with excessive labor. So these are very important nuances that you have to account for. And you also have to check trade, imports and exports, and compare of each country, and compare the volume of each, and compare volume and prices of each. Now, again, one of the most important factors which you have to include in the Maltese side is the economy surrounding the British base. And that's something you would have to account for. And that included most of the services, basically. So, basically we had very slow but consistent growth throughout the 1920s and 1930s. And we had a major event in the 1940s which radically and drastically changed the economic and social structure of Malta. Now, the immediate effects were total workforce of 85,971 people registered, a membership in the General Workers' Union, which was a very large share of the workforce, of 29,660 people. And there's also workers in other unions as well, around 3,649, but the General Workers' Union is the overwhelming union, and it is basically leading the new working class movement. And it has become a major dominant force in politics, enabling, of course, the Labour Party to win the elections in 1947, winning the elections for the first time in history, and also winning the elections by a landslide as well. Now, these were events which are also in line with foreign events, especially in Britain, where you have a similar situation with the rise of the Labour Party, also winning elections with a landslide. Also for the first time in history, I think, as well. So you have the emergence and rise of social democracy in Europe. And Malta was moving along with the times here. So you had an organized workforce basically of 38.7% who were members of trade unions. More than a third of the workforce was member of a trade union. So this is very significant. You have a gainfully occupied population of 76,624 people, and layoffs from the dockyard have already started. People are already getting fired from the dockyard. You already have riots. This time things are different. There is a working class movement which is not afraid to challenge the traditional British authorities as they were, which included the Admiralty and the British government, the imperial government, was represented by the governor. But we have discussed already that the Admiral had even more influence and effective power than the governor himself, because he was the employer, after all, and the biggest employer in Malta. Workers employed by the British services, roughly 28% of the gainfully occupied population, around 21,646 people. Most of these people were members of the General Workers' Union now. So basically, you have a workforce which is very rigorously organized in trade unions. Government expenditure reached £3 million, £362 in the financial year 1945-1946. This is even before the Labour Party enters office. So government expenditure has more than tripled since 1931, when it hit £1 million in expenditure for the first time. In Cyprus, it hit £1 million later, around 1935-1936. Initial war damage fund was £10 million. It was approved already in 1943. And by 1947, nearly half of it was already spent. So in 4 years, nearly half of it was already spent. £4.8 million. So more than £1 million every year spent in reconstruction. This was basically a massive reconstruction boom in Malta. And there were a lot of jobs in construction, of course, and this is when architects and Maltese contractors started making big money. The fund was to be extended and increased even further. The fund went on eventually until the late 1960s. Wilfred Woods in the late 1940s had already recommended to increase it to £26 million. Eventually, if I'm not mistaken, more than £30 million were spent by the 1960s We're gonna see more details about it later. In fact, I think it was even higher, yes, because the higher contemporary reconstruction estimate was at least £50 million. Look, the War Damage Fund was funded by the British government by a vote by the British Parliament. So this was British aid, effectively. So it's very important to account for it, because later on we are going to discuss the 1970s and the new agreements about the British base, and we're going to discuss the negotiations between Malta's Prime Minister Dom Mintov and his arguments. And one of his arguments was that Malta didn't receive Marshall aid, and which was true, but Malta did receive a lot of aid from the British government after the Second World War. Most of it was in the War Damage Fund. The War Damage Fund went to mostly reconstructing houses and buildings which were destroyed during the Second World War. So if you had a residence or a property which was destroyed during the Second World War, you would apply for these funds to have it rebuilt. So already we see a growing economy, even by simple statistics and data. We have growing entrepot trade, which was around £449,000, £131 in 1947. So already after the Second World War, you have entrepot trade activity. Registered private cars, 3,559 in 1946-1947. Figure in 1940-41 was 546. So a new middle class is forming, and is forming very fast. Now this is the end of the slide presentation, but we're going to discuss how this newfound and sustained economic growth was not enough, especially considering the fast increase in the population, a baby boom, and the demand for work, which was too high for the supply of work that was available still. And immigration was basically one of the most major and significant components of the Maltese economy. So because you have to keep in mind that this is like the return of the 1880s, the Suez Canal boom and the coal boom, but this time you have the expectations of a working class which doesn't want to return to poverty and misery, and is struggling to secure basic economic dignity, so to speak. So the demand for sustained economic growth, the political demand, so to speak, for sustained economic growth was now permanent and was in play, especially by the fact that you have parliamentary democracy and you have political parties representing the Maltese who are expected to address the expectations of the working class and the emerging middle class. So this is also why it was the end of the intermittent economy. There was also democracy, and Malta was part of other countries in Europe where the arrival of democracy coincided with improved and the arrival of more voting rights, because you also had the vote for women for the first time in 1947, which is also very important. Women voting for the first time in mass in general elections. So the increase in voting rights and the increase in democracy always coincided and was followed by improved economic conditions. So if you have democracy, the expectations for decent economic life are more easily expressed through the political system. So Malta's case is not unique. It has its own very distinguished and distinct economic and social particularities, but Malta is going through social, political, and economic phenomena that is common to Europe as well and other European countries. So, and in the next lecture, we are going to see how this reconstruction played out in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And we're going to see especially the effects of the property boom, which then went to extremes in the 1960s and had some severe implications in the economy, which are also similar to stuff that we are experiencing in the economy today. So, and again, this is also why I see the 1930s and the 1920s as uneventful when compared to the changes that came due to the Second World War. So as you can see, you had very limited democracy in the 1920s and 1930s, and you had very limited slow economic growth. Then you had more democracy in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. You have faster economic growth. You have more events taking place and more social, cultural, economic development. So this is all for now, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to support our work, and also by subscribing to our website. So thank you very much, and good night for now.